So, the last couple days we talked about uh, plants specifically and kind of the details of um, parts of the plant, and then we talked about photosynthesis, cellular respiration, and that whole thing. So, I think I'm going to skip ahead a little bit and skip over um, looking at humans specifically and some of the things that go into that, and just uh, do the same thing that we did with plants, but kind of focusing on animals. So again, thinking bigger picture as opposed to small cellular. We're looking at organisms in general. So where I want to start today, and again, we'll just kind of see how far we get. I don't have. I think we definitely will get to some questions at the end of today. My social studies class is running long. I'm going to make sure I stop time to do some. But I want to go over Darwin and his theory of evolution. So when it comes to talking about history of animals and plants for that matter, because Darwin's theory of evolution doesn't just apply to animals, but we're going to kind of focus on the animal side of it. The theory is that, and again, it's a theory, right? That populations evolve over many generations, slowly over time, right? It isn't something that happens right away, and it's not something that is stagnant for a long period of time. In other words, species don't stay the same for long periods of time. Given enough time, they will slowly evolve. And Darwin says they will evolve specifically to better adapt to survival, right? That's nature's natural tendency, right? And if you take isolated populations, in other words, you take a population of something and isolate it, in other words, don't allow it to interact with any other species, that will evolve differently than the original population. So if we took any animal and stuck it on an island and didn't let the people or the animals on that island interact with any other animals of that same species for generations, that population would evolve differently than a different population. And he specifically studied birds. So he spent a lot of time in the Galapagos Islands, where he looked at, I think, finches. I think. I'm not positive. But anyway, that's not important. What's important is he looked at the same species of bird, okay? Same species of bird on different islands that were not, they were far enough away where birds weren't flying back and forth to these islands. Right? They were stuck on these islands. What he noticed was the same bird on a different island had developed different traits. Okay, so he also argues that, and I'm kind of pointing to the PowerPoint here if you can't see my cursor, over generations, isolated populations evolve different traits, which is the first part of what I said, but given long enough, they actually evolve enough to where they are no longer able to reproduce with the original population from where they started. And that's the point at which they become a new species entirely. So Darwin had this theory of universal common ancestry, the bottom part here, and that suggests that all organisms on Earth evolved from a single common ancestor, and then over many, many, many generations, right? Everything evolved from that one single bird. Scientists have now linked all things to kind of three main domains: Eukarya, bacteria, and archaea. And so this is kind of the tree of life, as they refer to it. And bacteria and archaea, these two groups here, are very similar, not identical. They're all single cell organisms. Okay, I won't get into the differences between bacteria and archaea because they're very similar and share similar properties. And again, for the purposes of today's discussion, I want to focus more on animals. But notice the name eukaryota, and that refers to eukaryotic, right? Or in other words, their cells are made up of a nucleus or have a nucleus in it, right? So these are going to be less evolved, more simplistic organisms, and the further out on the tree you get, the more complicated or more complex the organism tends to be. Why animals are way out on the end, because they're some of the most complex organisms we have. Okay, so now let's just look at kind of big picture stuff and try to not get bogged down with too scientific stuff. But I want to talk about natural selection. So the phrase or the saying survival of the fittest, that comes from Darwin. Darwin felt that literally only the strongest organisms would survive, and that over the course of lots of generations, what that meant was that species would become more adept at survival the longer they evolve. Because if you have a strong, healthy animal breeding with other strong, healthy animals, what's going to be the end result of that? More strong, healthy offspring. So if you have that happen over generation and over generation, then that species is going to get stronger. And the organisms or the animals that aren't able to do that are the ones that die off, or the ones that don't reproduce, right? So again, his theory of natural selection is that most organisms produce more offspring than are able to survive. That's the other part of this. So part of it is the survival of the fittest, right? The kind of saying of, the strongest, smartest, best hunters, most intuitive. Those are the animals or the organisms that are going to survive and breed. But also, he theorized that organisms specifically produce more offspring than are able to survive, knowing that that exact thing is true, right? So this is an example I usually kind of use a drawing for, but I don't need it. So just kind of bear with me. Let's take a fish, for example. And I'm just making these numbers up. But I know a fish is an animal that has a lot of eggs, right? Like they produce a ton of eggs. So let's say one fish produces 10,000 eggs. I'm, again, making that number up. Darwin says that those animals have adapted to produce more offspring than will survive, knowing that only a few of them are going to end up surviving, but that the numbers prove, or the numbers work out to where that species is able to survive and thrive. Okay, so let's take our fish. So a fish breeds and has 10,000 eggs, and those 10,000 eggs are fertilized. Actually, let's not even say that. Let's say 10,000. A female fish has 10,000 eggs. She lays all 10,000 eggs. Okay? So let's say, for the sake of easy math, half of those eggs become fertilized by a male fish successfully. The other half get washed away or get eaten before the male is able to fertilize them, or whatever you want to say. Let's just say, right off the bat, 10,000 becomes 5,000, all right? Now, we've got 5,000 eggs that are fertilized, and let's say that half of those eggs, well, let's not say half. Let's say 1,000 of those eggs don't hatch. They get, again, eaten, they die off because they get swept away or whatever. Let's say 1,000 of those eggs die before they become a living, whatever the term for a tiny, tiny baby fish. There is a term, but I can't remember. It's the end of the week, so my brain is not functioning on all cylinders. But let's say 1,000 of those fertilized eggs are gone. So now we're down to 4,000, right? 4,000 eggs hatch out of the original 10,000, and those fish then start their trip down the river to the ocean to then grow into full-size fish. Now, out of those 4,000 fish, let's say half survive the first week, right? Because again, there's lots of predators, they're very small, so they're susceptible to lots of different things, right? They're not very resilient. So now we're down to 2,000 fish that have maybe made it from a tiny little fish to maybe now they're like a fingerling or like a small fish, but they're growing, and now the more they grow, the more their odds of survival increase because they are able to eat on their own a little bit. They're bigger and stronger, so they're able to protect themselves a little bit more, but they're still susceptible, right? Now we're down to 2,000 little fish. Let's say another half of those fish get killed off or get eaten by other fish or by birds or what have you, or die for whatever reason. They don't. These fish need to eat, right? So if they're not eating enough, they could die. If they get attacked by other fish or other predators, they could die. So there's lots of things that factor in, right? So let's say half of those. So now let's say another half of that live to be, juvenile fish that make it to the ocean. Let's say out of those 1,000 fish, half of those fish die from, again, the ocean is a dangerous place, right? There's sharks, all kinds of things going on, right? Again, they need to be hunters because they need to be making sure they eat enough food. So all those factors in. Let's say 500 of those fish then become adult fish, and those 500 fish start their process of coming back upstream to spawn. And again, not all of those fish are going to move, right? There's fishermen. There are, again, bigger predator fish. There are sharks. There are all those things. So let's say out of the original 10,000, only 100 fish end up coming back to spawn. That's still a lot of fish per that one original fish. Now, again, I'm making up all those numbers. I have no idea how accurate they are, but just to kind of prove the point of what natural selection says, that fish has evolved to produce way more eggs than they need to survive, right? And that is what keeps the species of that fish healthy and, alive for generations. That was a long example, but hopefully that makes sense, right? So again, some of the things with survival of the fittest, one of the things that I didn't mention, right? Offspring must compete for resources, food, water, shelter, right? So again, it wouldn't be feasible for all 10,000 of those fish eggs to hatch and survive and become adult fish. The species wouldn't survive if that happened either, right? I mean, all 10,000 can't die, but all 10,000 can't live because if all 10,000 fish were to live, there would be too much competition for food, for water, for shelter, right? And so that wouldn't work either. So nature has evolved this balance of, the strongest and the most adapt are going to survive, and the others aren't. And that's just nature. So this last part here, based on the traits or variations, certain offspring will survive while others perish. That's kind of what we said. Offspring that inherit favorable variations are said to be more fit to survive, more likely to reproduce. So if we look at something like a lion, and again, I'll make this example shorter, but if we take a lion, right, what are the characteristics that make a successful, healthy lion, right? They need to be big and strong, protect themselves, protect their pride. They need to be fast. They need to be smart. They need to be able to be successful hunters, right? All of those things factor in. And if they're not those things, they're not going to survive. So being bigger and stronger and faster and smarter, those are traits that are going to be more likely to produce an animal, a lion in this case, that's best suited to reproduce, and then their offspring are going to have those same, more likely to have those same traits. All right, so let's keep moving on here because I don't want to get too bogged down. But speciation, so we have some different things here. Allopatric speciation, and again, don't panic or feel like you need to remember these terms. Isolated groups take advantage of resources. Sympatric are not isolated, but there's very little overlapping. And then adaptive radiation, adapt in the same area to eat different foods through developing different body parts. So we'll come back and talk about that in a minute, but I want to move. I want to move past that. And yeah, this is what I want to talk about. So we'll come back to those practice questions. But when we talk about natural selection and Darwin and evolution, right? We talk about the idea of evolving these traits. What are some of these adaptations that are beneficial for survival? Okay, so when we talk about animals in general, we kind of break them into two categories: prey and predator. Prey animals are what? They're animals that are being hunted. Okay, so think of types of prey. In other words, animals that are susceptible to being hunted by other animals. Deer, fish, I don't know. You come up with your own example. Let's take deer, okay? What makes for a successful and alive deer? What kind of traits keep deer alive, right? We know they're not the smartest, okay? But they are very fast, so they have speed to help run away from predators, right? If deer had evolved to be very slow and they didn't have any other means of protection, they wouldn't last very long. They'd be extinct, right? So prey adapt certain variations or certain evolutions to be more susceptible or more successful at surviving. So camouflage. Again, deer have a certain amount of camouflage if they're, in a open landscape. Sometimes it's hard to point them out against like the brown backdrop. Other animals you can think of have used camouflage to their advantage. So camouflage would be one. Mimicry, looking like a more dangerous organism. So you have animals that aren't dangerous, that aren't predator animals, but that look that way or pretend to look that way. The example here is you have certain snakes that have similar color to venomous snakes, but that aren't venomous or aren't predators. You have protective coverings, sting, like the bee stingers, or smell, things like skunks. So you get porcupine. They're not predators, they're prey animals, but they have adapted quills to protect themselves from other predators, right? They're not fast either. Same with skunks. Same with bees, okay? Turtles. Turtles obviously aren't fast, but they've survived this many years because they've adapted to have this big protective shell. And then, like I mentioned, so on the flip side of that, and this is the last, we'll go over this and then we'll do a couple of practice questions. But on the flip side of that, we have predators. Okay, so predators are the animals that are doing the hunting. Just like prey animals, so prey animals have adapted certain skills and certain traits to help them survive. Predator animals have adapted certain traits to help them be effective hunters, right? If you think of any predator, whether it be a lion, a tiger, a bear, an owl, cheetah, right? A cougar. Those animals, if they lacked certain traits, they wouldn't be successful hunters, right? So some of the predator adaptations would be things like night vision, so owls. Owls aren't the biggest, strongest predator. They have developed a sense of night vision so that they can hunt at night when other animals can't see as well. Again, speed. Lions, tigers, and bears wouldn't be very successful hunters if they weren't fast enough to catch the prey, right? So they have to be pretty fast. Now, in some of those predators, right, because they're not as fast as the prey, they've had to develop other techniques, like lions, wolves hunt in groups, right? And so there's a level of intelligence that they've had to develop to make up for the fact that they're fast, but they're not as fast as antelope or a deer or something like that, or a gazelle. So again, another type of adaptation. Smell. Some predator animals like sharks or lions have incredible senses of smell. They can smell animals miles off. And then you have things like heat senses, where you have snakes that can sense how close different prey animals are. Right. So with that said, I'm just going to stop there and move on to some practice questions while we have enough time for it. So let me stop this and pull up practice questions. Okay, so questions 1 and 2 here talk about this diagram here, okay? So I'll go ahead and read through the paragraph and then talk about this diagram, and then we'll look at the 2 questions. Okay? So the paragraph says, the forelimbs of humans, penguins, birds that fly, and alligators are all similar. The similar pattern of the bones is evidence that these animals evolved from a common ancestor. Similar structures that organisms have inherited from a common ancestor are called homologous structure. Bear with my pronunciation. That could be right or could be wrong. So it's saying, here's a human arm, here's a penguin's flipper, a bird's wing, and an alligator's leg. And they are pointing out the various similarities to show you that, again, it's a theory, but only based on the fact that they have all these similar components. Right? So that's what we're taking away from the diagram. So let's look at the first question. The first question says the forelimbs of frogs are homologous to those of human arms, penguins, flippers, birds' wings, and alligators' legs. Based on the diagram and the paragraph, which of the following is likely to be true of frogs' forelimbs? A, frogs use their forelimbs for swimming. B, frogs' forelimbs contain carpal bones. C, frogs' forelimbs resemble wings more than they resemble human arms. Or D, frogs are more closely related to humans than they are to alligators. Okay, so I know what I'd get rid of, okay? So again, we're looking for which of these things, based on the diagram and the explanation in the paragraph, is most likely to be true. Okay? So they show us a human arm, a penguin's flipper, a bird's wing, and an alligator's leg, and they say that a frog's forelimb is similar to all those as well. So the 2 I'd get rid of right off the bat are C and D. C, frogs' forelimbs resemble wings more than they resemble human arms. They're not, we don't have the information to know that that's true. It might be, but we, A, don't see a diagram of a frog's forelimb. And B, the question or the information doesn't say one is more similar to the other. It just says these 4 things are similar, right? So we don't have the information to be able to make the assumption that C is true, okay? Same with D. Frogs are more closely related to humans than they are to alligators. Okay? First of all, it doesn't sound likely that it's true, but even if it were likely, right, we don't have the information in front of us to know that that's the case. Okay? So C and D jump out to me as being easy throwaways. So what we're left with is A, frogs use their forelimbs for swimming. B, frogs' forelimbs contain carpal. So what do you think? Okay. These are both viable options. In other words, they both sound reasonable. Okay. But again, we're looking for what is most likely to be true, or what is, sometimes what's the best answer for these questions is just what is most clearly proven based on the information. And even though A sounds likely, frogs use their forelimbs for swimming, that sounds like it's probably true and it makes sense. But there's nothing mentioned in the paragraph about swimming or about any of the actions that these animals are taking. It just says structurally they're similar. So we should only focus on structural things. Therefore, B makes the most sense. Frogs' forelimbs contain carpal bones. There's your answer, all right? So let's look at number 2. Number 2 says, which of the following statements is supported by the paragraph and the diagram, okay? So similar question, except we're not asked to take a new animal and apply it, right? We're just saying, based on the information we have, which of these statements sounds best? Okay? A, the tip of a bird's wing is homologous to the upper arm of a human. B, penguins are more closely related to humans than they are to birds. C, in penguins, flying birds, humans, and alligators, the forelimbs have similar structures despite performing different functions. Or D, homologous structures have similar functions in modern organisms but have different functions in modern organisms' ancestry. Let me make sure I'm on it, okay? So, let's pick out a couple to get rid of. And I'd say B would be the first one. Penguins are more closely related to humans than they are to birds. Penguins are a bird. They're a flightless bird, but a bird nonetheless. So that doesn't sound likely. But again, whether or not it's true or false, it's still wrong because there's nothing in the information we have that supports that statement. So throw it away. Okay? The next one that I'd throw out would probably be a toss-up, but probably D. Homologous structures have similar functions in modern organisms, but have different functions in modern organisms' ancestry. There's nothing in here that tells us anything about these animals' ancestors, right? So we don't know that. That's an assumption we can't make. So it sounds good, and there's lots of big fancy words, but it's telling us something that we have no evidence of, right? So we need to throw it out. So between A and C, what sounds the most reasonable? A, the tip of a bird's wing is homologous to the upper arm of a human. Or C, in penguins, flying birds, humans, and alligators, the forelimbs have similar structures despite forming different functions. Okay, so the trick here, or the reason that A is maybe a little tricky and might sound correct, is because it's talking about the bird's wing and the human's arm. But the key word here is, it says to the upper arm of a human, right? The upper arm implies like this section, right? But the forearm implies this section here, right? And so that difference tells us that the tip of a bird's wing isn't homologous to the upper arm, it's to the forearm, to the lower. So A is wrong. And the best answer and the only answer left is C. In penguins, flying birds, humans, and alligators, the forelimbs have similar structures despite performing different functions. Okay? We know that those 4 animals do different things, but the structure of their forelimbs are still similar. That's the only statement that we can really say definitively is supported by that information. Okay? So I've got 1:45, so I'm going to go ahead and stop there, and we will pick up where we left off today and spend a little more time talking about animal organisms and keep moving on through biology. I hope to get through the biology portion or the life science portion of the GED information next week. So we'll spend one more week on life science before we kind of move on. So with that, I will let everyone go. This is the last class of the week. So have a good weekend, everyone, and I will see you back Monday for more classes. So that's all I've got. So unless there's any questions, I will let you all go before I bore anyone to death. All right, have a good one.